So let's talk for a second about comfort foods. And the work that I'm going to refer to is work that was done by a very impressive scientist by the name of Mary Dahlman. Her work goes back decades. She was at University of California, San Francisco. And she asked this question that on the face of it seems kind of obvious, but for which there was no mechanism known until Mary and her lab personnel came along. And the question was, why do we seek high fat and or high sugar foods when we are stressed for a while? Why would that be? And the reason is that the so-called glucocorticoids, of which cortisol is a glucocorticoid, is caused, as we've mentioned before, by releasing hormones from the brain and ACTH from the pituitary, etc. But normally, high levels of glucocorticoids shut off the releasing hormones in the brain and in the pituitary. They shut down in a so-called negative feedback loop. So just like if testosterone or estrogen get too high, that's read out, or that is seen, so to speak, by neurons in the pituitary and brain, and then we shut down our production of estrogen and testosterone. If cortisol levels get too high, if there's too much cortisol floating around in our bloodstream, there's a negative feedback loop, and the brain and pituitary shut down CRH and ACTH, which would otherwise stimulate more cortisol. So cortisol levels go down. So it's a beautiful negative feedback loop. Chronic stress, however, stress that lasts more than 4 to 7 days, and there's a way to think about what chronic stress really is in an actionable way, causes changes in the feedback loop between the adrenals and the brain and the pituitary, such that now the brain and the pituitary respond to high levels of glucocorticoids, cortisol, by releasing more of them. It becomes a positive feedback loop. And that's bad. It actually gets right down to levels of gene regulation and transcription and translation. And so you really don't want chronic stress, because it's a cascade of stress equals more stress equals more stress. So this is why it's very important to learn to turn off the stress response. You don't want it elevated for too long.
I've seen some studies that have also correlated specifically lower body, I think strength of lower body with improved cognition. And I was wondering, just for me, I don't like, why not upper body? Why lower body? Like, do you think is there a, potential, like, people that are also doing cardio or getting some lower body strength? And or do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer the question, but it's interesting to note, some of these correlations come up, and when it's a correlation, obviously it's association, and people want to know, is it causative, right? And so you always kind of hedge your bets. And what I say to people, I said, I don't know, but it's not a bad goal to aim for, to have stronger legs and be able to move around. And if it correlates with, improved cognition and mental function as you age, if that's a connection between the two, it's not a bad goal to aim for. Whether one causes the other, I can't say, but I'll take it if it's a causative relationship, for sure.
So one of the most important findings in neuroscience in the last 100 years is that pleasure and pain are co-located, by which I mean that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain.
That's so crazy.
I know. And they work like opposite sides of a balance, like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground, except when the balance is at rest and level, it's actually parallel with the earth. It's not tipped one way or another. So when we do something that's pleasurable or reinforcing or rewarding, that balance tips to the side of pleasure. When we experience something painful, like cutting our finger, it tips to the side of pain. But one of the overarching rules governing this balance is that it wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be tipped for very long, either to pleasure or pain. And the brain will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. And one of the things that I find fascinating is that it's really a biological imperative, not just in our own physiologic symptoms, but in the universe, to go to homeostasis. And that any deviation from neutrality is actually a form of stress. In fact, biologists define stress as a deviation from neutrality.
In either direction.
In either direction, right. And that's the key. Getting back to sort of the problem with modern life, and one of the main problems with modern life is that we have too many pleasurable substances and behaviors, and that is actually stressing us out. It's literally stressful because we're causing this huge deviation from neutrality.
Why is it that people with obesity have so much of it and it's not suppressing their excess body fat mass? And the concept that has been invoked to explain this is leptin resistance. So in the same way that people can develop insulin resistance, where it takes more insulin to do the physiological jobs in the body, people with obesity require more leptin for the hypothalamus to be satisfied. So another way to say that, they require more leptin to avert the starvation response that the brain has, that where alarm bells start going off because it thinks you don't have enough body fat. So they require more leptin to achieve that state. And
so why is exercise so good for us? One of the core habits practiced by the most successful people is, well, you guessed it, exercising. Have you ever wondered why? In his book, The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg talks about what are known as keystone habits. These are the habits that, if practiced, developed, and applied, influence change in every aspect of our lives. Exercising is a keystone habit, which is why anyone looking to develop self-discipline regularly goes to the gym or does some form of exercise. So we all know the physical benefits of exercise, right? You look better, you lose weight, you become lean, you gain muscle, and generally, you become fit. These changes are easily observable by the naked eye. However, the benefits of exercising aren't just skin deep. Most people who exercise will observe that they're happier, more motivated, and less depressed. This is why exercise has been described as the miracle drug and has been recommended as a treatment for depression, insomnia, memory loss, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's disease, among others. The reason for this is that the body naturally produces hormones while exercising, and these hormones are serotonin, endorphins, and a protein known as brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Each of these hormones in their own way helps reduce stress levels, lifts someone's mood, aids in better sleep, improves learning, and also leads to increased confidence. When you start exercising, especially for the first time or after a long break, you'll feel more alert and energized because ramping up your heart rate means a boost in overall flow and oxygen to the brain. This releases a special brain cell called dopamine, which is responsible for motivation. If you've ever felt tired or lazy and don't feel like doing anything, that's because you're experiencing a dopamine deficit. Dopamine is responsible for our motivation and attention, and it's responsible for the feeling of satisfaction when we accomplish something. It makes you want to do things, and it reassures you that the thing was worth doing. So if you're experiencing a dopamine deficit, you can find it hard to get things done, because you're not getting enough fulfillments to justify doing them. But whenever you exercise, you directly increase the amount of dopamine in your blood, and instead of feeling tired and worn out, you suddenly feel motivated and energized.